You're listening to Wildlife Control Consultant, where we provide research-based information on all things related to vertebrate pest management. Hi everyone, Stephen Vantassel here, Wildlife Control Consultant, bringing you another episode of the Wildlife Control Consultant Show. Glad to have you on board here. I hope your week went well. If you're wondering what this is all about, this podcast is all about technical issues related to vertebrate pest control. So those are controlling animals that have a spine. So while we do deal with insects from time to time, that's not the focus of our presentation. Here, this podcast, what we deal with is insects as they relate to vertebrate pest control, or primarily vertebrate pests, things like raccoons, skunks, squirrels, moles, voles, etc. Anything that has a backbone, but not people. So if you have a moment, we'd love to have you subscribe to the channel, of course. And if you have questions, comments, thoughts, we'd love to hear from you. You can reach me at wildlifecontrolconsultant@gmail.com, wildlifecontrolconsultant@gmail.com. Would love to hear from you. I have been quite busy this past week. I had the privilege to speak before a state pest management association, and the week prior to that, I had to speak before a state association of landscapers and ornamentalists. So that was a privilege as well. But travel can certainly take the life out of you, and it always takes longer than what you think it's going to take. But I'm very glad to have it. I love those opportunities. So if you're interested in having me come and speak to your event, definitely reach out to me at wildlifecontrolconsultant@gmail.com. We can discuss that. Also do it by Zoom, or I can have it in person. Either way, we can certainly work out some arrangements. This week, I wanted to talk a little bit about anticoagulants. These are rodenticides. Those of you that have been following my channel for a while know that rodenticides, those are poison baits used to kill rodents, fall into two major categories: anticoagulants and non-anticoagulants. And so since I was asked recently to do a presentation on getting sort of a deep dive into the anticoagulant and rodenticide sphere, because anticoagulants are the largest group of rodenticides, thought I would just give a few highlights of some things about anticoagulants that you may not know, or perhaps you heard of before, but perhaps forgot, because as concern is growing around the country, probably not all of it is legitimate, but there's certainly great need to be concerned about rodenticides. I mean, these are toxic products, and they do pose a threat. I'm not necessarily condoning the California approach, which is sort of, the more something works, the more likely we're going to ban it. I think there are some other options that are available, but that's not going to get into that political/scientific debate today. But I do think it's important for vertebrate pest specialists, PCOs, pest control operators, pest management professionals to have a better understanding of anticoagulants and the rodenticides that they're used in. So before we get into that, you can certainly see some of the literature that I have available. You can see some of the books that I have for sale, and some of the other materials that I have for sale as well as consultations. So I'd love to, if you're interested in any of those, definitely reach out and order them from my store. You can purchase those at wildlifecontrolconsultant.com. All right, well, let me pull up my slide here and get that opened up and pull up my slideshow from current slide. So let me go back and just talk briefly about the research. When research is done on rodenticides, one of the things that's challenging when we start talking about things like how effective something is, how quickly an animal dies, and that is, it is difficult to always compare a laboratory study to the experience in the field. And so I'm not trying to diss laboratory research. That's not the point here. We need people to do laboratory research without a doubt. But there is a gap in understanding because we're not omniscient. We don't know everything. We don't have, while video cameras can be very helpful, whenever you're putting animals in a restrained environment so that we can monitor them, we're obviously impacting the experiment itself, right? So this is one of the challenges, and these are just part of being the limitations of being finite. And that's just the reality of it. It's not something that we should be, oh, it's a lab study, it's worthless. That's nonsense, okay? Lab studies have a very important role, but we have to understand what the limitations of laboratory studies are. So one of the issues is, of course, is that sometimes when we're looking at laboratory studies about what's the secondary poisoning, for example, of anticoagulants, and you may see a lab study that says, well, see, the animal, we fed an owl for 5 days, poisoned mice, and the owl had no symptoms of illness. That could be true depending on the rodenticide that was being fed to the rodents. The problem is that an owl in the field is going to undergo more stress than an owl in a laboratory. And so in an owl in the field, he's got to navigate trees, he's got to fly at night, he can be injured, and so just the mere injury that could occur with an anticoagulant, for example, he may not heal properly, and he may become in a weakened state, and therefore as he's hunting additional animals, he could not only get additional exposure to rodenticide, but also another additional injury. And so the injuries by themselves may be enough to hinder the prolonged life of that particular raptor, for example. And this is something that we wouldn't necessarily see in a laboratory environment because the laboratory animal is not being held under the same level of stress that animal would have in nature. And so this is part of the challenge that we have here. It's just something to keep in mind. But something I wanted to delve a little bit deeper in, and that is, how long does it take for an animal to die when it's exposed to different anticoagulants? Now, anticoagulants fall into two major categories. So let's back up a little bit. So all rodenticides fall into two major categories: anticoagulant and non-anticoagulant. Anticoagulants kill the animal by interfering with its ability to clot, the blood to clot. Non-anticoagulants kill the rodent by other means. We're not going to talk about the non-anticoagulants today. We're just going to focus on the anticoagulants. Within the anticoagulant framework, there's first-generation anticoagulants and second-generation anticoagulants. We're not going to go through all the ones in the second gen, but in the first generation, there are three: warfarin, chlorophacinone, diphacinone. So any other anticoagulant is going to be held into the second generation category, at least the ones that are registered in the United States today. So warfarin, chlorophacinone, diphacinone. Those are first generation anticoagulants. First generation anticoagulants, the rodent has to feed on the bait multiple times to obtain a lethal dose. Second generation anticoagulants, the rodent only needs to feed once to get a lethal dose. Second generation anticoagulants, as a general rule, are orders of magnitude more toxic than first generation anticoagulants. I'm just going to throw out something to analogy to illustrate this. So, for example, if it took let's say, an ounce of first generation anticoagulant to kill a rat, it would take a gram to kill of second generation anticoagulant to kill that same rodent. Now there's about 28 grams to an ounce. So just to kind of give you a sense, now that doesn't come from reality, but I'm just trying to illustrate how much more toxic a second generation anticoagulant is compared to a first generation anticoagulant. Both anticoagulants, both classes of anticoagulant are effective and they're highly toxic, but one is like, wow, majorly more toxic than the first generation anticoagulants. Okay, so a lot of times professionals, if you're a professional that you're listening to this, generally speaking, most of you are going to be using second generation anticoagulants to kill your rodents. Some of you are going to be using non-anticoagulants. I'm not going to talk about that today, because you're thinking, I'm a professional, I need to use the most toxic material. I want the problem to be solved quicker. But is that true? Let me illustrate. This is from findings. Again, these are laboratory studies, just truth in advertising. But understand, all the rodents in this particular study would have basically the same level of stressors, no matter which poison they ate. So in that sense, we're dealing with an even playing field. Okay, so a Norway rat obtains a lethal dose of warfarin. That's a first generation anticoagulant. Notice he doesn't begin to die. They don't start dying until day 4. However, some rats, that's the Norway rat here, some take as long as 10 days to die, D10. Okay, what about a roof rat? Well, this particular study looked at the roof rat, both the male and the female, and treated it with warfarin. Notice how some of the female roof rats died on day 2, but others took as long as 13 days to die. All right, how about the males? Well, the males didn't start dying till day 4, and some also took 13 days to die. Okay, how about a house mouse? Notice the house mouse took 3 days for some of them to die. Other house mouse, it took 30 days for them to die. Now, all the study subjects here were wild mice. These weren't the laboratory mice that just are always bred under captivity. These were captured wild rodents that were then brought into the lab and tested to see how long it would take for these various anticoagulants to kill the rodent. Now, warfarin, you're like, oh, Stephen, that's such an old rodenticide. I wouldn't use warfarin. Okay, well, that's fine. Let's look to chlorophacinone. Many of you may know of it as under the brand name Rozol. Okay, Rozol is owned by Difethialone. Difethialone has complete control of chlorophacinone because they have the patent to it. That's not always the case for some of the other active ingredients. Some of the active ingredients are sort of out in the wild where any company can use that active ingredient. Well, in this case, Difethialone owns the patent to chlorophacinone. Notice how long it takes for the roof rat to die from chlorophacinone. First one can die in 4 days. However, some will take as long as 19 days to die. How about brodifacoum? Now, brodifacoum is a second generation anticoagulant. I call brodifacoum, if you go back to some of my other podcasts, I did at least 3 podcasts doing a deep dive on brodifacoum. Brodifacoum, I call it the nuclear weapon of anticoagulant rodenticides. Yeah, I know it's a bit over the top, to be sure, but it kind of gets your attention, right? But it is a hot product, and I mean by hot meaning it's extraordinarily toxic. Okay, it is. If you're dealing with a rodent that you have got to make sure one bite's going to whack that thing. If you have a good formulation, of course, everything relates to formulation. If they don't eat it, it doesn't matter how toxic it is, right? Brodifacoum's pretty hot stuff, but notice how long it took the house mouse to die with brodifacoum. Day 4 was the first date, but some took as long as 21 days. Now compare that to warfarin. A first generation anticoagulant where it went out to 30. So the most you would save is 9 days. And in fact, in one case, some mice die quicker with warfarin on day 3 than the brodifacoum in this particular study, where they started dying on day 4. So you can see that just because something is extraordinarily more toxic doesn't necessarily mean that the rodent is going to die quicker. But then you have something like bromadiolone. Bromadiolone was used on Norway rat, and the first Norway rat died on day 4, but the last one died on day 6. So there you go. It's different species can take different lengths of time to die initially, or in some will linger on even later. Because again, not all rodents have the same susceptibility to the same active ingredient, right? And so this is why it's so important for you as professionals to monitor what you're doing and to be sure that you're not just using the same active ingredient over and over and over and over again for years on end, because you might start developing some resistance, whether that's behavioral resistance or biological resistance. Well, does formulation matter in terms of how quickly a rodent can die? Well, take a look. Notice that all of the active ingredients here are with second generation anticoagulants. So we have nothing in this particular slide that is of first generation. All of these are the more toxic products, the second generations. It's bromadiolone, brodifacoum, difenacoum, difethialone, and I think that's all I have here, listed. So the first 4 samples here, where you see the active ingredient listed, and these are with wax blocks. So the active ingredient is formulated into a wax block. Notice how both with bromadiolone, brodifacoum, difenacoum, and difethialone, the fastest the rodents died, and these were all Norway rats that was studied in this particular project. The fastest those Norway rats died was 3 days. The longest it took those rodents, the Norway rats, to die of these 4 active ingredients was 11 days. But the median, not the average, the median is the number where half the sample is above that number and half the sample is below that number. The median death rate was 5 days to 4 days, and some were 4.5 days. So bromadiolone wax blocks, fastest that Norway rat died was 3 days. The longest surviving rat took 11 days to die. The median was 5 days. Brodifacoum wax blocks, fastest was 3 days. The longest it took the one Norway rat to die was 7 days, with a median of 4.5. Difenacoum was with the wax blocks. 3 days again was the fastest they died. Maximum length of time was 8 days, with a median of 4.5. Difethialone wax blocks, again, the minimum time it took to kill that Norway rat was 3 days, and it took a maximum of 5 days to kill, with a median days of 4. So even though we only have 5 days for the longest rats, that means half the population basically took the 5 days, and half the population only took the 3 to 4 days. So kind of interesting there. What about grain as the formulation? So here we have only 2 products that were tested that I have listed here. I shouldn't say tested. I didn't list everything in the particular study as I recall. Brodifacoum and bromadiolone. Both were mixed in with a grain formulation. Of course, rodents love grain. They love that loose product. But again, that also poses a greater risk for the transportation of that bait. So it can be placed in areas where we don't have controls. You need to be very careful with your use of grain baits. So again, the fastest they died, however, was 3 days. Remember, there's a delay effect with anticoagulant rodenticides. And the maximum date was 8 days with bromadiolone, and 7 days for brodifacoum, with a median of 5 days for brodifacoum and a median of 4 days for bromadiolone. So you can see how even though brodifacoum killed the rodents 1 day quicker, that when you look at the median number, it was actually 1 day longer than bromadiolone. See how the understanding a little bit of statistics there can kind of help you understand that a lot of times when we say one product kills faster than others, you would never really be able to tell the difference sometimes in a field setting. All right, let's get into pellets, which is our last example here. Bromadiolone, here we're looking at bromadiolone, brodifacoum, and difethialone. So with bromadiolone pellets, the fastest the Norway rat died was 3 days. The maximum was 7, with a median of 5. Brodifacoum pellets, the minimum time to die was 4 days. Again, the maximum was 7 days again, and the median was 5 days. Difethialone pellets, fastest they died, the Norway rat died, was 3 days. And the maximum was 7 days with another median of 5. You can see the numbers, as far as the median and maximum days, they're all the same for bromadiolone, brodifacoum, and difethialone pellets. Norway rats basically died about the same time as any of the formulations. So what does this teach us here a little bit? If you're using second generation anticoagulants because you're hoping that it's going to kill the rats faster, it's not necessarily the case, right? It could happen. I mean, what I basically tell people is that as a rule, you might get a day or two faster death with a second generation anticoagulant than you would with a comparable first generation anticoagulant. Will your customer ultimately notice? Probably not, because again, they all have a delayed effect because even second gens don't act really that much faster as far as the initial rodents dying. There's always going to be 2 to 3 days before that rodent is going to die under the fastest conditions. And often it could be out to 4 days. Notice we have one brodifacoum pellets. It took the rat 4 days to die as the quickest way to go, but others were, of course, 3 days. And then the maximum was far more variable, everything from 11 days with wax blocks, down to 5 days for wax blocks with difethialone. So there's a lot of variability here, and it also boils down to, we haven't even discussed, how much did the rodent eat, how palatable is the formulation, because if the rodent is not liking the bait, it doesn't really matter. He may not eat enough to get a toxic dose. He might get sick, just become wise to it, and now we have behavioral resistance. Use the product that's going to be best suited for your situation. I would suggest that you consider the fact that perhaps we're using second generation anticoagulants more frequently than we need to. Second gens are an important tool, and I'm not here to bash second gens, but as I said, they are significantly more toxic than first generation. What is a good use of a second gen anticoagulant? A good use of a second generation anticoagulant is when you're in a situation where there is so much competing food available, like the client is unable or unwilling to clean up, to reduce available food sources. Those situations you may need to use a second gen because you may only get the rodent to bite once, and you want that to be a toxic bite. But for the vast majority of our clients, a first-generation anticoagulant, you're not seeing trash and food and grain all over the place, right? The person just needs some rodent control. Your first-generation anticoagulant, provided it has good uptake, good formulation, it's attractive to rodents, you will find that will be enough because the rodent will feed on it enough can be consumed. It may require you to visit a little bit more because you can't allow that bait to go out, because if the rodent only gets one dose with the first generation anticoagulant, and they can't come back and get a second dose because you didn't refill it, then they're going to get sick and then they're going to get wise to it. So that may require a little bit more visitation. But again, I think most places you're not having that level of mouse pressure, because even if you needed to use a second gen, maybe you need to use a second gen to start with to knock that population down, then you can always follow up with a first generation to clean up the matter if you've been able to clean up competing food sources and do the habitat modification and exclusion that's necessary. But if you're just trying to kill your way to success with a really toxic rodenticide, that's really not an IPM approach when it comes to rodent control. So let me try to summarize this again. Again, first generation anticoagulants, multiple consumption is required. Second generation, only one bite is enough to kill that particular rodent. We call one feeding. But even with that, it doesn't necessarily mean the rodent's going to die faster. Think about the fact, do you really need to use a second gen anticoagulant? Sometimes you will, if there's a lot of competing food sources. Most of the time, I think for the majority of your clients, they're not filthy pigs, right? They don't have food all over the place. You can probably get the job done with a first generation anticoagulant, provided you just make sure you use the maximum application dosage to be sure that the rodents have sufficient access to food. That may require a little bit more visitation, but remember, first generation anticoagulants have a lower secondary poisoning as a general rule of thumb, and so that's something that we need to be thinking about. Use your understanding of rodenticides to apply the correct bait and correct control method to the situation that's applying, so that we can keep these tools available, minimize the negative effects, so that we can develop trust with a wider public. Hope you found that helpful. Again, these are highly toxic products. We want to make sure that we're using them appropriately. Don't just be a poison jockey, that you're just putting out bait and not thinking about what it's doing, how is it working, is this an appropriate situation. Hope this information on time to death it will be helpful for you to understand how long it takes for rodents to die after they've been exposed to these particular products. I'm Stephen Vantassel. You've been listening to the Wildlife Control Consultant podcast, where we discuss all things technical related to vertebrate pest control. Would love to hear from you. You can reach me at wildlifecontrolconsultant@gmail.com, wildlifecontrolconsultant@gmail.com. Love to hear your comments, thoughts, yes, even criticisms. And if we can be of service to you, perhaps editing your PowerPoint, perhaps helping you with a consultation, helping you with some ghostwriting, definitely reach out to me at wildlifecontrolconsultant@gmail.com. wildlifecontrolconsultant@gmail.com. Well, till next time, everyone, take care.
This is the disclaimer for Wildlife Control Consultant podcast. Vertebrate pest control is an inherently dangerous activity involving risk of bodily injury to you, others, and/or property. Vertebrate pest control also involves legal issues, so be sure to always follow national, state, provincial, and local laws when using pesticides and/or other control methods when controlling pests. Wildlife Control Consultant LLC, Stephen M. Vantassel, or their affiliates are not responsible for your use of the information provided here. Always consult a qualified and appropriate professional before employing the information provided here.